You ever think about how a single story, just a simple parable, could actually create a rift between entire communities that last for centuries? It sounds kind of wild, but history shows us that the stories we tell, and, maybe more importantly, how we tell them, have just immense power. Today, we're going to unpack one of those stories, a biblical parable, whose meaning shifted over time and created a divide that would last for thousands of years. So, a lot of us have heard the parables from the New Testament, right? They usually feel like pretty straightforward moral tales. But what if one of the most famous ones has this hidden history? A story of evolving meaning that tells us less about the original tale and way more about the people who kept retelling it.
Okay, that is a seriously chilling line. It's from the parable of the wicked tenants, which you'll find in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's dramatic, it's violent, and man, does it set the stage for a theological conflict that would echo for 2,000 years. So let's really dig into how this one line, and the story it's in, became so dangerously divisive.
We're about to see how this parable's meaning was never really set in stone. Instead, it kind of shifted and changed over time, acting almost like a mirror that reflected the growing and really painful tensions between the early Jesus movement and the wider Jewish world it came from.
All right, so the basic story on the surface is pretty simple. You've got an owner who leases out his vineyard. When he sends his servants to collect his share of the fruit, the tenants beat them up, kill some of them. So finally, he sends his own son, thinking they'll for sure respect him. But as we just heard, they kill him too, hoping they can just take the vineyard for themselves. It seems like a simple story about justice, right? Well, its meaning is anything but simple.
To really get how the meaning changed so dramatically, scholars have kind of peeled back the layers of history, and what they've found are three distinct levels of interpretation. This is where things get really, really interesting.
First up, you've got what scholars call the Jesus level. So, what the story probably meant to Jesus' original audience. Then, there's the gospel level. That's how the gospel writers adapted the story decades later for their communities. And finally, you have the later Christian tradition, how the story was used long after the final split between Judaism and Christianity had already happened. This table just lays out that whole evolution perfectly, so let's walk through it. At the original Jesus level, the vineyard was a super common symbol for Israel. And the critique, the bad tenants, that was aimed squarely at the religious leadership in Jerusalem. Not all Jewish people, but watch what happens. Decades later, at the gospel level, as tensions are rising, the story becomes about the conflict between the Jesus movement and other Jewish groups. And then, the meaning just completely transforms. In later Christian tradition, the tenants get interpreted as the Jewish people as a whole, and the story is used to claim that they are being replaced by a new group. It's a tragic shift that has a name: supersessionism, or replacement theology. And that's an idea with just devastating historical consequences.
But here's the thing, that interpretation didn't just go unanswered. History is always a conversation, and the rabbis of the time, well, they had their own stories, and some of them seem to be in direct dialogue with these new Christian claims, offering a really powerful counter-narrative.
In these ancient rabbinic texts, we find a parable that is strikingly similar. There's a king, his property, some bad tenants, and a son. But the ending is completely different, and that final twist reframes the entire theological debate.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the whole argument. You see, the Christian reading of the parable implied that God was replacing the unfaithful tenants, who they interpreted as Israel, with a new people. But the rabbinic version pushed back hard. In their story, yeah, the bad tenants are replaced, but the property is ultimately given back to the original family's descendants. The point of the rabbinic story is crystal clear. God's covenant with Israel is unbreakable. You can get rid of bad tenants, sure, but you can't replace the family itself.
You know, this same pattern of reinterpretation, it doesn't just apply to parables. It happens with people, too. Let's shift gears now and look at the Apostle Paul and see how our understanding of this hugely influential figure has been totally transformed by modern scholarship.
The traditional view, the one a lot of us probably learned, paints Paul as the very first Christian convert. He supposedly ditched a rigid, legalistic Judaism to go start this new religion of grace. But modern scholarship paints a radically different picture. Paul, the committed Jewish theologian who most likely remained Torah-observant his whole life. And in this view, his mission wasn't to start a new religion, but to solve a puzzle. How do we include non-Jews into God's existing covenant with Israel?
To really get Paul, you have to picture his world. I mean, he wasn't sitting in a monastery somewhere. He was a Jew living in the diaspora, operating in these bustling, multicultural Roman cities like Corinth. His challenge was super practical.
What do we do with all these non-Jews who are drawn to the message of Jesus? How do they fit into the picture? So this is a huge point. When we read Paul, and he seems to be speaking negatively about the law, this new perspective argues he isn't attacking the Torah for his fellow Jews, not at all. He's actually arguing that non-Jews don't need to take on the full yoke of specific Jewish identity markers like circumcision and dietary laws to be welcomed into God's covenant.
And this led him to this, just a brilliant and really elegant theological solution, one that scholars now call one covenant, two paths. It was a way to include everybody without erasing what made them different.
So how did Paul justify such a radical idea? Well, he went way back to the beginning, to the patriarch Abraham. Paul pointed out something that was basically hiding in plain sight in the book of Genesis. God considers Abraham righteous because of his faith. And this happens long before the Torah was given at Sinai, and, this is the crucial part, before Abraham was circumcised. For Paul, this was the theological key that unlocked everything.
So the big takeaway is that faith becomes the universal entry point. This meant non-Jews could join the covenant through Jesus without having to convert to Judaism. But at the same time, Jewish followers of Jesus were still expected to live as Jews and observe the Torah. What you get is two distinct groups living in two different ways, but united within a single covenant. It's just a breathtaking vision of unity without uniformity.
So we've seen how a single story could literally be weaponized to divide people, and we've seen how a key historical figure who is misunderstood for centuries might actually offer a vision to unite them. This isn't just ancient history. It forces us to ask a really pressing question for our own time. How does understanding the full history of a text or an idea or even a person change what it means for us, right here, right now?